When a racist landlord evicts a hardworking black single mother without warning, he expects her to quietly accept defeat. But what follows is a powerful story of resilience and determination as she fights back in a way that leaves him and everyone else completely stunned. Her comeback is more than just personal. It's a battle for justice that no one saw coming. Angela Moore stood on the cracked, worn-out linoleum floor of her small, cluttered apartment, clutching the eviction notice like it was a grenade. She reread the words for what felt like the 100th time, hoping she had somehow misinterpreted it. But no matter how many times her eyes scanned the page, the words didn't change. Eviction notice. Vacate within 30 days. The sting was still fresh, as if the paper itself was cutting into her hands. Her landlord, Victor Hutchins, had dropped it off personally. He hadn't bothered to hide his satisfaction. "Can't say I'm surprised," he had sneered, looking down at her as if she were beneath him. "People like you never last long around here." "People like you?" Angela knew exactly what Victor meant. She wasn't blind to his racism or the disdain in his eyes. She was a black single mother raising her 8-year-old son, Jaden, in a neighborhood that was becoming more gentrified by the day. Victor had made his feelings clear since the moment she moved into his dilapidated building 3 years ago, muttering comments about standards and keeping the building respectable. Now, after years of subtle racism and outright neglect, he was finally evicting her. Victor had never made any real repairs to the building, despite her repeated requests. The plumbing was ancient. The paint was peeling, and there was mold creeping through the cracks in the walls. But none of that mattered to Victor. He wasn't interested in maintaining the building for the tenants who had lived there for years. No, he was interested in upgrading the units, raising the rent, and attracting wealthier, whiter tenants to Crestwood Heights, a neighborhood rapidly gentrifying as more and more developers swooped in to capitalize on the soaring property values. Angela had suspected this day might come, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. She had worked so hard to secure this apartment, working 2 jobs as a nurse's aide during the day and a cashier at a local grocery store by night. She had scraped together enough to move to Crestwood Heights, hoping it would give Jaden a better life. The schools were better here, the parks were safer, and it wasn't far from the hospital where she worked. But none of that mattered now. In 30 days, she and Jaden would be homeless unless she could figure something out. Angela sat down on the edge of the worn-out couch, her mind racing. How was she going to find another place on such short notice? Rents were skyrocketing everywhere, and she'd barely made enough to cover this place. The thought of uprooting Jaden from school, finding a new home, and starting over made her feel sick. "Mom?" Jaden's soft voice pulled her out of her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, clutching his favorite action figure, his dark eyes full of concern. "Are we going to be okay?" Angela swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Of course we are, baby. Don't you worry about a thing. I'll take care of it." But inside, she was terrified. She had been through tough times before, but this felt different. This felt like a final blow. She was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. She had worked so hard to give Jaden a stable life, and now, in an instant, it was slipping through her fingers. Angela wasn't the only one facing eviction. Over the past few months, several of her neighbors had received similar notices from Victor. Most of them were longtime tenants, people who had lived in the building for years before gentrification started creeping in. Most of them were also Black or Latino, and many were single parents or elderly. Crestwood Heights had once been a diverse, working-class neighborhood, full of families like Angela's. But over the past few years, developers had started buying up old buildings, renovating them, and marketing them to wealthier, mostly white tenants. The rents had skyrocketed, pushing out longtime residents who couldn't afford to stay. Victor had jumped on the bandwagon, eager to cash in. Angela had watched as families she knew were forced to leave one by one. Some had moved to cheaper areas further from the city, while others had ended up in shelters. It was clear that Victor didn't care about the people who lived in his building. He only cared about the profit he could make once they were gone. She had tried to stay under the radar, paying her rent on time every month despite the deplorable conditions. But it didn't matter. To Victor, she was just another tenant standing in the way of his plans. The next morning, Angela woke up with a pit in her stomach. She had to do something. Sitting around and feeling sorry for herself wasn't going to solve anything. She knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. After dropping Jaden off at school, she made her way to the Tenant Rights Coalition, a local organization that helped low-income tenants fight back against predatory landlords. Angela had heard about the group from a friend, but she had never thought she would need their services. Now, she had no other choice. At the office, she met with Tanya Williams, a lawyer who specialized in housing law. Tanya was a tall, no-nonsense black woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for being relentless in court. She listened intently as Angela explained her situation, taking notes and nodding thoughtfully. "This isn't surprising," Tanya said when Angela finished. "Victor Hutchins has been doing this for years. He's been evicting tenants left and right so he can renovate the units and charge 3 times the rent. And he's been targeting Black and Latino families because he knows they're less likely to have the resources to fight back." Angela felt a surge of anger. She had known Victor was racist, but hearing it confirmed by someone else made her blood boil. "Is there anything we can do?" Angela asked, her voice laced with desperation. Tanya nodded. "We can absolutely fight this. Evicting you without cause is illegal, especially since you've been paying your rent on time. And if we can prove that he's been targeting tenants based on race, we can hit him with a discrimination lawsuit." Angela's heart lifted slightly. She had come here expecting a long shot, but Tanya was giving her real hope. "What's the first step?" Angela asked, sitting up straighter. "We'll file a complaint with the city's housing authority and get the ball rolling on the lawsuit," Tanya said. "But I'm going to need you to gather as much documentation as you can. Lease agreements, rent receipts, any communication you've had with Victor. We'll also need to talk to your neighbors. If they've experienced similar treatment, it'll strengthen our case." Angela nodded, feeling a sense of purpose begin to replace her fear. She had been through enough in her life to know that giving up wasn't an option. Victor might have underestimated her, but he was about to find out that she wasn't going down without a fight. Over the next few days, Angela went door to door in her building, talking to her neighbors about what was happening. Many of them had received eviction notices just like her, and they were just as scared and angry. But they hadn't known where to turn or how to fight back. With Tanya's help, Angela began organizing her fellow tenants. They formed a tenants association and started holding regular meetings in the building's dingy basement. At first, the turnout was small, just a handful of families who were fed up with Victor's treatment. But as word spread, more and more tenants began showing up. Angela quickly became the leader of the group. She hadn't set out to be in charge, but her passion and determination inspired others to take action. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone in the building, for every family who had been pushed out by greedy landlords and discriminatory practices. As the group grew, they began sharing stories of Victor's harassment and neglect. One woman, Maria Sanchez, had been dealing with a broken heater for months, forcing her family to endure freezing temperatures in the winter. Another tenant, Mr. Thompson, an elderly black man who had lived in the building for over 30 years, had been threatened with eviction after he complained about the mold in his apartment making him sick. Angela documented every story, gathering evidence of Victor's pattern of abuse. The more she uncovered, the angrier she became. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about an entire community that had been exploited and mistreated. With Tanya's guidance, the Tenants Association filed a class action lawsuit against Victor Hutchins, accusing him of illegal evictions, racial discrimination, and neglecting necessary repairs. The lawsuit wasn't just about getting the evictions overturned. It was about holding Victor accountable for years of abuse and exploitation. As the legal battle unfolded, Angela found herself at the center of a growing movement. The local news picked up the story, and soon reporters were showing up at her door, asking for interviews. Angela had never been comfortable in the spotlight, but she knew how important it was to raise awareness about what was happening. She appeared on local news channels, speaking passionately about the need for affordable housing and the rights of tenants. Her story resonated with people across the city who were facing similar struggles. She became a voice for the voiceless, standing up to powerful landlords who thought they could trample on the rights of low-income tenants with impunity. The lawsuit dragged on for months, with Victor doing everything he could to delay the proceedings. He hired high-powered lawyers to try and intimidate Angela and the other tenants, but they refused to back down. With Tanya by her side, Angela pressed forward, determined to see the case through to the end. As the lawsuit gained momentum, the city's housing authority launched its own investigation into Victor's properties. What they found was shocking. Victor had been violating numerous housing codes for years, neglecting basic maintenance and repairs while charging exorbitant rents. Many of his properties were in dangerous disrepair, with mold, faulty wiring, and leaking pipes. But that wasn't the worst of it. The investigation also uncovered evidence of widespread racial discrimination. Victor had been systematically targeting Black and Latino tenants for eviction, using any excuse he could find to push them out and replace them with wealthier white tenants. He had been falsifying documents, forging lease agreements, and using shady tactics to justify the evictions. The city's findings were damning, and soon, Victor found himself facing not only civil lawsuits but also criminal charges for fraud and housing violations. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The day Victor was arrested was a day Angela would never forget. She watched the news coverage in disbelief as police led him out of one of his luxury condos in handcuffs. The same man who had smugly handed her an eviction notice months earlier was now being hauled off to jail, his reputation in ruins. With Victor behind bars and the lawsuit settled, the Tenants Association finally had a chance to breathe. The new property management company that took over Victor's buildings agreed to make the necessary repairs and freeze rent increases for the next 5 years. The tenants had won a hard-fought victory, and Angela had been at the forefront of it all. As part of the settlement, Angela received compensation for the emotional distress and hardship she had endured. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to change her life. With the money she received, Angela was able to buy a small house in a nearby neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe, and it was hers. She no longer had to worry about being evicted or dealing with a racist landlord. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of security and stability. Jaden was thrilled with their new home, and Angela couldn't help but smile as she watched him run through the yard, playing with his friends. She had fought hard for this, for him, and she had won. Angela's fight didn't end with the lawsuit. Inspired by her experience, she began working with tenant rights organizations to help others who were facing eviction and discrimination. She knew that her story wasn't unique. There were countless families out there struggling just like she had, and she wanted to make sure that they knew they didn't have to face it alone. Angela became a fierce advocate for affordable housing and tenant rights, speaking at community meetings, organizing protests, and lobbying for stronger housing laws. Her story had inspired others to stand up and fight back, and together they were making a difference. Years later, as Angela stood on the porch of her home, watching Jaden grow into a strong, confident young man, she couldn't help but feel proud. She had been through hell and back, but she had never given up. And in the end, her comeback wasn't just about defeating Victor Hutchins. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her power, and her future. Her journey had left the world in shock, but to Angela, it was just the beginning. In the end, Angela's story was one of resilience, determination, and justice. And her comeback? It wasn't just priceless. It was a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, no matter how overwhelming the odds.